You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week, Sarah Goodyear and Doug Gordon of the War on Cars podcast joined the show to talk about their new book, Life After Cars, Freeing Ourselves from the Tyranny of the Automobile. We discuss opposing views, turtle Jesus, and potential off-ramps towards car-free cities. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire.
What if tackling climate change starts with rethinking who holds power? I'm Candace Lewis-Wilson, Senior Program Director at Center for Public Impact.
And I'm Gabrielle Barron, Senior Program Manager in the Climate Action Team at the Centre for Public Impact. We're the new hosts of Reimagining Government. In Season 4, we're exploring what happens when those too often excluded from decision-making lead the way.
Across 6 episodes, we'll spotlight leaders who are transforming how we respond to the climate crisis.
They're redesigning cities, challenging climate colonialism, defending the Amazon, mobilizing global activism, and bringing youth voices into politics and policy. At its heart, this season isn't about carbon emissions.
It's about power, who has it, how it's shared, and how reimagining leadership from the ground up can reshape the future of government for everyone. Subscribe and listen now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Doug Gordon and Sarah Goodyear, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it's a thrill to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves? We'll start with Sarah and then Doug.
Okay, so I am a New York native, but I've lived in other places. I've lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've lived in rural Maine, but I've spent most of my life in New York. I'm a career journalist. I was a general interest journalist for a long time, did a lot of cultural criticism and just other kinds of reporting and essays and so forth. And in 2006, I answered an ad to cover a press conference that Mayor Mike Bloomberg was giving to announce Plan YC, and that ad was placed by Aaron Naparstek of Streets Blog. And I took the assignment. I turned it around for the next day. I guess I did okay because soon I was freelancing for Streets Blog on a pretty regular basis. And that turned into me making urban design and transportation planning and all of that good stuff my beat. And I have been writing about that for almost 2 decades now, and for a variety of outlets. And yeah, we started this podcast 7 years ago now. So I'm somebody who just always loved everything about cities and the way they work. And I found a way to make that my work.
So I got involved with Safe Streets advocacy really in earnest around 2010, although I had always been interested in it. I've lived in New York since the late 90s. I grew up in a town north of Boston on a cul-de-sac, no sidewalks, off of a busy road where you couldn't really walk anywhere. But my family was from New York. We visited. So I sort of had this sense of like, oh, okay, this is what a city is, and I might want to live here. So I started my blog, Brooklyn Spoke, in 2010. And it was at about that time that the Prospect Park West bike lane fight, which some of your listeners might know and remember, was really heating up in Brooklyn. This was a big project under Mayor Bloomberg and Jeanette Sadiq-Khan that a bunch of neighbors in our community did not like. A lot of neighbors did like it, but the ones who didn't like it had a lot of power and a lot of sway, and it turned into a very big fight. And so I was covering that at a kind of very granular level, and it just got me more and more involved with Safe Streets advocacy, and started volunteering for transportation alternatives, going to community board meetings. And long story short, I'm a TV producer and writer by professional trade, and I sort of like brought those skills to bear on my advocacy. And started the podcast, and here we are.
How did you all first meet? Like, what was the first interaction you had with each other?
Sarah and I don't remember the exact first time we met in person, but like these things happen. You follow someone online, you read their writing, especially given the advocacy that I was doing. I was following all the smart people and reporters who were covering these issues. And Sarah, I think you might have actually been at Grist, or at least doing a few things when I first became aware of you.
I was at City Lab, probably.
Maybe, yeah. And so I think we just sort of started having, it's a weird thing, but pleasant interactions on social media. And, I was sharing her stuff and really learning stuff from what she was writing. So, but I actually don't remember prior to the podcast, like we had met probably at press events or things like that.
I think actually we may have met briefly at the protest outside the 9th Street Y, around the 9th Street bike lanes and de Blasio and all of that. I think that
might have been it. Yeah.
That might have been where we actually met each other for the first time.
Do you think we would know this part of the story? But
I know. It's just as if we've known each other always. No. I was the same with Doug. I was reading his stuff. And one of the things I did for Streets Blog was I put together what we called the Streets Blog Network, which was, I was just trying to find people everywhere who were blogging about these issues, and Brooklyn Spoke was definitely one of the blogs we brought in. So that's probably when I first became aware of Doug online. But I seem to remember you at that rally. And if I didn't introduce myself, I knew who you were then. I was stalking you.
My reputation preceded me.
Yes.
I mean, that makes a good point about like meeting Confederates, meeting people that are on the same wavelength and getting out and doing stuff and getting together with folks of like-minded interests. Now a lot of stuff is online. People meet online, they advocate online, but there's something to getting out and being at those protests at places where people can actually, meet face to face and get together.
Yeah, I always felt very strongly that I did not want to be just the bomb thrower online, that I felt was very important to get involved in real life stuff. Some of that stuff comes from my parents, who are very involved in the community when I was growing up. So I always felt it was like I would go to community board meetings, I would go to transportation alternative, like local committee meetings and volunteer trainings. And I think being in real life conversation with people is a very, very important thing. And certainly now.
Yeah. And actually, I would like to say that from my perspective, as somebody who came up as a journalist in the 90s and early aughts, you used to go out and report in the world a lot. Like that was the main way you did reporting, was that you would go to a place where people were and ask them questions and write them down, even on a piece of paper. And the more journalism became not that, and the more it became like sitting in front of a computer and aggregating content and researching things online and just working off of the computer, the more dead it became to me. And one of the things I really like about working in audio is that you get to go out and get audio, and you have to get that in the real world if you're going to get it. And there's so many situations. It just has a kind of a tactile quality, even though it's not something you can touch, but it does encourage going out into the real world.
It can be fun to kind of stick a microphone in somebody's face sometimes, right? Like,
I
feel like a couple of times at TRB, I've done that to poster sessions and just been like, hey, what's the deal? And it's super fun to kind of go and interact with folks that way. What got you all to synthesize what you've learned from what you've been doing in a book?
Well, okay. So, having, again, worked in print media and online media, and then being sort of frustrated with those media and saying, okay, I want to do a podcast because that's a different way of reaching people, and trying to get out a message that has just felt increasingly urgent to me over the last 10 or 15 years. Then it was like, okay, well, we've got a lot of people listening to the podcast, but we need to figure out how to expand that audience again. And so a book is a wonderful thing. I mean, a book is a great technology. You can take it with you anywhere. You can get it wet and it still works. And I think that I just thought, hey, here's a way of doing this that would get the message out wider. And then, Doug, you can say how circumstances kind of conspired to make that a reality.
Publishing can be a very difficult journey for a lot of writers. I really can't complain. I'm not going to say that it wasn't a lot of work to write the book. It was a ton of work to write the book. We did a lot of research, but the way it sort of came together at the beginning was almost within a week of each other, two different sets of people emailed us and said, we think there's a book here. Have you ever thought about writing one? You seem to have the platform. The issue is very interesting and certainly very in the zeitgeist right now. And this was in, post-pandemic, let's say, when e-bikes and outdoor dining and all of this stuff was sort of in the ether. And it was just a sort of fortuitous timing that they both emailed at the same time. And we went with them as agents and we landed at Penguin Random House for our publisher. And like I said, it's not an easy process to write a book, but they helped make it a much easier one.
Why do you think Superman transitioned to fighting supervillains instead of cars?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so we open the book with a story of Action Comics number 12, which published in 1939. And in it, Clark Kent comes out of basically what is the Daily Planet and sees there's a little crowd that's gathered. And he learns that one of his very good friends has been hit and killed by a driver. And he, as a reporter, calls the mayor's office and says to the mayor, what are you going to do about it? Like, our city has one of the worst traffic problems in the country. Something has to be done. And the mayor, and we say this in the book, in a situation that will not be all that unfamiliar to a lot of advocates, the mayor is sort of like, yeah, it's a problem, but what do you want me to do about it? And he gets very angry, Clark Kent, and dons the red cape and turns into Superman and declares war on cars and goes around the city, smashing lemons at a used car dealership, stopping a cop from accepting a bribe from someone trying to get out of a traffic ticket, scares the bejesus out of the mayor himself who's driving, and turns things around basically in the city. And then, yeah, sort of as you're saying, over time, the sort of social justice warrior version of Superman, who really it was a New Deal, Roosevelt era version of this superhero who's tackling real social issues, just becomes he's battling Lex Luthor or, the villain of the week. I think that really speaks to, and we talk about this in the book, the growing acceptance that we have had in the United States over traffic violence and the role of the automobiles as unquestionable, as just part of the background that nobody can do anything about. But in 1939, Siegel and Schuster, the creators of Superman, would have been old enough to have known, our book is called Life After Cars. They would have known life before cars, or life with a lot fewer cars, and life with fewer people being killed by cars. And so you can imagine the outrage they must have felt when in New York, and they lived in Toronto, I think too, so many people that they probably knew were affected by this issue, or at least it was in the newspapers all the time. And I think it's just the sort of proverbial frog in the pot of boiling water. We just sort of haven't noticed the ways in which cars have grown up around us.
I think that's interesting, that transition kind of from that time period to, all the car companies kind of pushing forward to Ralph Nader's book, and then moving forward to where livable streets movement stuff gets stuck in the culture war. It's like this progression of ways of which the car has progressed into our lives, as you mentioned, like the frog boiling in the pot. And I'm wondering what you think about that progression over time and why we've gotten to this point where it's gotten to be this polarizing thing. Whereas in a lot of what Peter Norton shares in his book, Fighting Traffic, is it used to not be so controversial to be caring about people's lives, kids' lives. And now it's, a two-sided thing and caught up because of the way conservatives versus liberals talk about things.
I mean, I think a certain amount of it can be put down to money, right? There are huge corporate forces, that were heavily invested in creating this situation, and now they're very heavily invested in perpetuating the status quo. So we get a lot of messages through advertising and other media that cars are just there all the time. Cars are great. Cars are so wonderful. But I think that it's also the cognitive dissonance that's required of us because we have built an environment where 97% or whatever it is of Americans are engaged in daily car use. And if we were allowed to think about that, or if we allowed ourselves to think about it, every time we got into a car, wow, this is a really dangerous thing to do. This is dangerous to put my kid in the back seat. This is polluting my neighborhood. I'm alienated from my neighbors. If we thought about all those things every time we got into a car and started it up, it's very challenging. It's really kind of challenging to your entire lifestyle and your entire set of values and what it is that you do every day. And that's very scary to say, like, hey, the whole way I'm living my life is unhealthy and dangerous and not good for me mentally. It's much easier to retreat into kind of the certainty of, but this is the way it is. And that's just the way it has to be. We talked to Dr. Ian Walker, really fascinating researcher on these things. And he said, it's this principle in behavioral psychology called the is-ought fallacy, which basically people see that this is the way it is, therefore that's the way it ought to be, and they accept that. But I think this issue of cognitive dissonance, of not allowing yourself to think that there could be something better, because if you did think that there could be something better, having to deal with the way it is might be painful or scary. And it's a defense that's exploited by politicians.
Yeah, it is interesting how, though, I think on the culture war front, I think there was a period, especially when we started the podcast and before, where, we used to joke on the show that like Democrats and Republicans can't agree on anything. Liberals, progressives, and conservatives and people to the farther right cannot agree on anything. But the one thing they can all agree on is hating the bike lanes, hating the bus lanes, right? Like we would always say that it was often in some of the most progressive places, right? Park Slope, where the Prospect Park bike lane fight went, or Berkeley, California, Cambridge, Massachusetts, these like liberal bastions where people would be the biggest opponents of bikes. Yes, San Francisco. Yeah, you're pointing at your hat. Right. Like those were the places where the war on bikes, let's say, was fought at the most extreme levels. Now there is a little bit of a negative polarization happening, I think, where, because these things are so wrapped up in the culture wars, and we have so many more good examples of success also because we fought those early battles and won, that, people are coming around a little more. I think the reaction to congestion pricing and Governor Hochul pausing it and Trump and Secretary Duffy going after it, you're seeing people just kind of stand up for it because it's a pretty good, successful, progressive policy that also, is just a good policy. So that's been a real shift in terms of the culture war aspect of this.
I also find the idea of like historical off-ramps really interesting. And one of the things I think about a lot, and I've talked about on the show a couple of times, is the oil crises of the 70s and kind of that time period where several countries, and you talk about this in the book, De Stroget in Copenhagen, as well as Kindermort in the Netherlands, which is during that period, those countries had a chance and they chose to go a different direction than the United States. And there's several kind of off-ramps that we've had over time, and we've always chosen the route that goes towards cars. And so like we keep embedding this thing into our lifestyle that really harms us. And these other countries, they've gone other directions. And it's really interesting to think about these off-ramps, these time periods where we could have gone a different direction, but we didn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in the case of the oil crisis, I mean, that's where the forces that I was talking about before, the fossil fuel companies and the way that our government and our politicians have traditionally been beholden to those forces, that flip that happened at the end of the 70s when Reagan was elected in 1980, that to me is like such an important inflection point that, we had solar panels on the roof of the White House. We had people putting on sweaters and turning off lights and understanding that there's a limited amount of petroleum products in the world and that maybe we need to figure out how to make it so that fewer people have to burn those in order to get where they're going. And then, Reagan happened. And it's sort of like the 2000 election, how different would our climate trajectory be if those few hanging chads hadn't been there in Florida and we hadn't had the Supreme Court decide that election? Yeah. But I mean, there's another inflection point that I think is more positive, and that's the COVID pandemic. And we talk about this in the book. that, first of all, everybody learned over the few months before the vaccines, especially like, hey, if we can be outside, we can actually see each other again, right? So in cities all over the world and all over this country, there were people hanging out outside on the street, sometimes on open streets with outdoor dining, all of that. I think that really did a lot to change people's vision of the street because it was stuff that they had never actually seen implemented before. Suddenly it was implemented. Now, there's been a ton of backsliding, and New York didn't maintain its outdoor dining program the way that many wish it would have. And I hope with a new mayoral administration, we'll be going back to the drawing board on that. But I think that, if you look at the Great Highway example in San Francisco, I think that we developed a vernacular in this country of opening streets to people, closing them to cars, having fun, and realizing that that was possible. And hundreds of thousands of people experienced that in real life. And that's not an opportunity that we've had before. And I really think it has changed the mindset. So
I'm going to play devil's advocate here because we do host a podcast together. So I'm going to argue back with Sarah and say, yes, I think that's all true. And a lot of people bought cars during COVID because, like you yourself, Sarah, right, on the show, and we say this in the book, cars became a form of PPE during the pandemic. Yeah. You saw people like the investment now in drive-throughs, right? And like the elimination of even the fast food restaurants, like a place to sit down and eat your meal. You just pick up your food and go. So it's like, all of these things, it's like sliding doors, we can sort of pick one path or the other. I do think, to Sarah's point, I always say the term open streets, that was a real inside baseball urbanist sort of thing. What do you mean the streets open? I thought it was closed. No one can drive on it, right? And now you have like entire city departments and public facing programs where regular people are saying like, oh, have you been to the, Berry Street open street? Just regular people who are not urban planners or bloggers or podcast hosts, talking in, as Sarah said, this like vernacular that is expanding to more and more people. So, I think like everything in the country, it's like we take a few steps forward, we take a couple steps back. I do think the progress is forward moving, but it's always in fits and starts.
I do want to make another point about that, though. What was so interesting about the pandemic was that all the people who had been sort of toiling away at these ideas and tactical urbanism and variations on that prior to the pandemic, when the pandemic happened, a lot of those same people were part of the teams who were using those same strategies that they had been developing. They were like, okay, here's a great time to implement those. And I think that readiness is all, right? Like when the off-ramp comes, when the inflection point comes, you have to be ready for it. And so that's something I think advocates and like-minded planners and electeds need to be thinking about. It's like, okay, I've educated myself. I know what the tools are. How can I be ready for that opening when it comes? Because we don't know what the next opening is going to be. Is it going to be a natural disaster that damages your freeway so that you have to knock it down and create a beautiful waterfront place for everybody? Maybe it's that. There are going to be these things that happen. And so
maybe it's tariffs on cars, adding 25% to the cost of, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, what is a new car last week? I think it was like $50,000 is now the average price of a new car. Oh yeah.
People are financing cars.
It's crazy.
$700 a month or more.
Bonkers.
For auto loans that last longer than it would take to ever pay the car off. So,
Yeah.
I mean, all that gets me to think about something else you mentioned in the book, which is Lance Pritchett's social norm changes, silly, controversial, progressive, obvious. And right now it feels like a lot of the stuff, you were talking about the Great Highway, right now all the papers are like controversial. So it means that maybe the next step is obvious because it's so close to that next kind of quadrant.
It's funny because, the newspapers are playing that off as controversial, but it won in the election. Like that was voted on, right? So it is controversial by a lot. It is controversial among a small subset of people, as these things often are. One of the things we talk about in the book is at the end of our bike lash chapter and car culture chapter is that at the same time that New York Magazine under the Jeanette Sadik Khan era was running cover stories on bike lash and how New Yorkers are not ready to become Copenhagen. The New York Times ran a poll at the end of Bloomberg's term in 2013, and it showed something like 64% approval for bike lanes and the expansion of City Bike, for example. And I would joke that like if City Bike and bike lanes ran for mayor, they would have won. So, I always think, and I think this is a Jeanette line too, that the people are always ahead of the politicians. And it is for sure true that the people are ahead of the press. Now, we're lucky that we have like Streets Blog and, the stuff that we've been doing with the war on cars. But I think there's a growing sense in the media that like we need to talk to more than just the two people who are worried about losing their parking. Let's talk to like the mom in the cargo bike, the delivery cyclist, whoever it is. And you're seeing that fade a little bit. So what I always tell advocates is like, eyes on the prize, keep your head down. Don't react to every last terrible headline. I've done that for sure in my advocacy career. But like, I do think if you dig down and see who's showing up to meetings and who's voting, who's sitting at that outdoor dining restaurant, right? Those aren't advocates. Those are people who just think it's pleasant to sit there, that we are winning in that sense. So, we'll see what happens with the Great Highway if like the opponents can turn things around. And I know it's cost some people their jobs, but, I do think people are winning.
Yeah. The other thing about the Great Highway is that one of the reasons why it was closed down is because the dunes are going to take it over at some point anyway.
Exactly.
It's one of those natural process things.
It does seem like nature abhors highways.
Yeah. And I do know some of those people who are against it, by the way. So I know that that's out there. But I do think sticking with something through those 4 phases and being willing to stand there and take it when people are calling you or saying all these things about it and making fun of you or saying, oh, this is terribly controversial. It's terribly dangerous what you're doing. You have to have some courage.
Sarah, how many folks do you know that hate things that you like? I mean, I've noticed in the book that, you knew somebody who didn't like Anne Hidalgo. And so I'm curious.
It's true.
I'm curious about that.
I know people in San Francisco who live in the Sunset who are opposed to what happened on the Great Highway. I also have a family member in San Francisco who really doesn't like bikes because she drives everywhere and she just thinks they just are always coming out of nowhere, because that's what bikes do. Of course, we know they come out of nowhere. I think any advocate for these issues knows a lot of people who are against them. I once was at a cocktail party and someone said to me, oh, you do a podcast called The War on Cars. Do you ever talk about the positive things that cars do? And I was like, no, I think other people have that covered.
Car industry's got that one down. Yeah.
Seems like they spend billions of dollars, tell you.
So, it's like, I guess I've always been a little out of step and out of sync with everything in my life. I've never done anything the normal way. So maybe I'm just used to being the odd one out and being willing to defend things that I think are defensible, whether or not the people around me think they're a good idea. If I can make my argument, I'm going to make my argument. So I'm just kind of used to it.
Do you have any folks like that, Doug, that you know who are on the opposite side of the way that you think about things?
I mean, I certainly hear it from folks. My wife's family is from the Midwest and other car-dependent areas of the country, which is to say the rest of the country outside of New York and a few small neighborhoods in other cities. And it isn't so much that they will complain like, oh, you bike people or you're living a pipe dream. I don't get that. It's more just the sort of like mindset of driving. We don't tell this story in the book, but I might have said it on the podcast. And I apologize to any family members who are listening, but we went to a long time ago when my daughter, who's now 15, was just turning 1, I believe. We went on a big ski trip to Park City and we like had a big condo that we all stayed in, like a dozen of us or whatever. And my wife and I, being New Yorkers, like looked at the map of like where the house was in relation to the bottom of the mountain. And we're like, oh yeah, we can just easily walk there. It's not that far. I mean, I doubt it was a quarter of a mile. And everybody else just defaulted to getting in their SUVs. We didn't make a big deal out of it. We didn't say like, why are you driving? We weren't obnoxious or anything like that. But, we were like at the bottom of the mountain, like in our gear and heading over to the lift before they were even just getting out of their cars after having looked for parking. And so it was just this sort of like, oh, you just drive. I don't fault them for that because it's just like we talk about in the book, the water they're swimming in everywhere else. I do have a lot of that of like, wait, you're walking there? Like, oh, okay, we're going to drive. It just doesn't cross people's minds.
And also, don't people ask you, Doug, like, are you going to be okay? Maybe it's because I'm a woman. It's something I get a lot. Like if I say, oh no, it's fine, I can just walk. And they'll say, but like, are you sure? Are you sure you're going to be okay? It's like, yeah, I'm going to be just fine. Yeah. Probably better than if I sit in that car.
It's funny because I think like bike advocates get accused of being almost like religious fanatics and like you're always proselytizing. And I actually think it's almost the other way. I am not very religious, but I just remember so many years where people would say to me, oh, you'll get older and, you'll lose a parent or something will happen in your life. And like, you'll have to find God and, you'll want that comfort of religion. And there's a mirror to that or a parallel in like, oh, your kids will get bigger and you'll have to get a car. You're like, life will get more complicated and you'll have to move out of your small apartment and move. It's like, nope, made it this far. My daughter is like a year and a half away from going to college. My son is about to turn 13. We love living in the city. We love living car free. And it's enabled us a lot of freedom to be able to be car free. A lot of privilege. It's not cheap to live in most of the neighborhoods where it is possible to live car free by choice. But I think there is that parallel there.
Jennifer Kent, a researcher out of Australia, talks about this, where there's inflection points in people's lives where they could choose to buy a car, whether that's when they have a kid or when their kids go to school or something along those lines. And, helping people make those decisions easier in terms of being able to like either go car light or get rid of your car is really fascinating to think about the different parts, because once people get a car, then the sunk cost fallacy starts to creep into their minds, right? And so you use it for more and more and more, and you bake it in, and you're already paying for it. It's already just sitting there, so why not just take it? And so, And Sarah, to your point about people asking you whether you're going to be okay, actually, my grandmother who lived in the East Bay, her neighbor, who was a very nice lady, and she came over and have wine with my grandmother all the time to hang out. And I would bike to my grandma's house from BART, and it was dark at night in the summertime, 9:00. And so I would start to go out of the house, and she would be like, "Are you going to be okay going back to BART on your bike? It's dark outside. Can I drive you?" And I was like, I kind of like this time, like to myself, to bike, to walk even on the trail. And so it was always shocking to me when that happened.
Yeah.
Another thing that you all mentioned in the book is the natural process of it all. And we had Ben Goldfarb on the show a number of years ago to talk about his book, Crossings, and you all talk about Paul Donald's book as well. It's just fascinating to think about how we impact nature with the amount of roads we build and the amount of focus we put on transportation of just cars, specifically because we impact genetic timelines and things like that. It's so interesting to think about how, negative we've impacted things because of our need to build a road somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that after reading Ben Goldfarb's book, Crossings, and speaking with him and with Paul Donald, who wrote a book called Traffication, my whole worldview really changed, because I'm the kind of person who I love the city and I love the country. I love wild places. I'm not good at the in-between. So I've spent a lot of time in nature. It's really important to me to know that it's out there. And that's one of the reasons that I am so fixated on trying to stop greenfield sprawl development, because we need to save every one of these places that we can. But yeah, the way that roads impact animals is so multifaceted, and it's all negative. And as you say, it cuts off populations from each other and creates genetic islands that animals can't move to reproduce. And so their gene pool is stagnating, essentially. The noise of roads, the noise of vehicles on roads can have an enormous impact. Up to a half a kilometer away from the road, you see animals suffering elevated cortisol levels and all these things that cause a lot of problems. Obviously, there's also just the smushing of animals, which happens a lot, including insects. And I think anybody who's older than 30 or 40 years old probably remembers how many insects used to hit your car all the time, especially when you were driving out in the country. And there just aren't as many. Like, I have definitely noticed a difference when I'm driving in terms of how many insects are hitting the car. I mean, millions and millions of insects getting killed all the time. And then the runoff from roads is also just incredibly toxic and, university researchers in Washington state have been able to isolate the compound in car tires that was causing salmon die-offs in Washington streams and rivers. It's just, there's so many ways. And so this is one of the things about electric cars that I want to say, which is electric cars will solve some of the problems with cars, but they won't solve all of them. And one of the problems they won't solve is roads. And roads are just, our planet is in such dire condition right now that now every time I see a thing about a road getting built somewhere that it wasn't before, it really gives me anxiety, because it's like, we just can't afford to build more of these roads than we already have. I mean, obviously there are places in the developing world that need roads. I'm not saying that those shouldn't happen. I understand that people in the developing world deserve access to transportation options the way that we do, the way that we have them in the developed world. But each road that is built is kind of a catastrophe in terms of the environment. And they're just spreading and spreading and spreading. And as Paul Donald talks, he says something like, in the UK, it's just patchworked to nothing. There's almost none of the UK left where there's a spot that's more than 2 kilometers from a road. And it's just tragic, frankly. And that's one thing that people just don't think about. And then the irony, and Ben Goldfarb talks about this, that the people who enjoy nature, there's no other way to get to nature, especially in North America, without driving. So all the people who are the most into going hiking and backpacking and rafting and whatever it is that you like to do outside, climbing, when you're driving there, you are very much part of this problem. And it's a terrible irony. And in some ways, I think it's almost one of the most difficult things to grapple with in terms of how do we solve these problems.
They're also fed these destructive advertising campaigns too, that you talk about in the book as well, right?
Yes,
with all the trucks driving over.
Oh my God, yeah. Turtle Jesus. Yes, Turtle Jesus with the Kia Sportage, who drives over the beach with a rake.
The thing with that one, and when I first saw it, I was like, "Aren't you gonna pull the turtle eggs up? What are you doing?" Yeah. I knew exactly what you were talking about when you said Turtle Jesus in the book, and I'd never even heard that term before. I hadn't seen the Reddit or anything like that, but yeah.
Also the name of my band, Turtle Jesus.
Turtle Jesus, that's good.
But yeah, the Land Rovers going up the sandy buttes or whatever. I mean, it's just, that's another thing that every time I see it, I almost have to run screaming from the room.
Yeah. Or the opposite of that, which is the driver in a city on the slicked, empty roads devoid of other cars and usually even pedestrians. I think all of these car commercials just need to come with little disclaimers that say, you will never drive like this. No one will ever drive.
Or you'll never be on the Bay Bridge as the only car unless you're part of a sideshow.
No, yeah, you will never drive through Lower Manhattan in your Range Rover at 55 miles an hour. You just won't.
Unless there's been a zombie apocalypse.
Well, I guess that's true.
Yeah.
I guess that's true.
Yeah.
What part of the book was hardest to write?
I think for me, in terms of really trying to wrap my head around it, it was probably the bike lash and car culture chapter, because there's just so much in terms of defining what car culture is. Sometimes you say car culture and people think of people who tinker on cars in their garage, or muscle car culture, things like that. But we were really trying to say no, American culture is car culture and vice versa. And that's the problem. That's the scope and scale that we're dealing with in terms of tackling this issue. And then sort of speaking to advocates as well, not just new people, but speaking to the people that I'm in conversation with and giving some good guidance for advocates of what are you going to hear when you start advocating for a bike lane or something like that in your neighborhood. So it's really trying to boil down these are the things people always say. They're common, this is in Amsterdam. I never see anyone biking. And also the bike lane is so busy that it's very dangerous, things like that. So really trying to boil that down to its essence, I think, was for me the hardest to wrap my head around. But I just want to emphasize that was a great problem to have of taking, over a decade of knowledge and experience and other people's writing and all the rest, and synthesizing it down into a digestible chapter for, like I said, the people who are really new to this issue and the people who are coming at it with a lot of enthusiasm.
Yeah, for me, it would be, there are 2 chapters in the book. One is called Cars Ruin Society, and the other is called Cars Are Unjust. And initially that was sort of conceived as one chapter, and it's a measure of the difficulty of it that it became 2 chapters over the course of the writing, because there was just so much there. But I think that what was hard, especially in the Cars Ruin Society chapter, which really talks about the way that cars make us lonely, cars divide us from each other, cars reinforce a lot of social division, that there was so much there that I knew intuitively, that, so much that I just feel to be true and know to be true in my bones, and making sure that we brought all the evidence to bear. And that and this is the way that cars were sold. Initially, cars were sold as a way for people to connect, right? There's some stuff that didn't make it into the book that was all about how a book in 1916 was talking about how now farm boys were going to be able to find better girls because they could drive farther, and that the girls would be excited to see them coming in an automobile because they would know that that would mean they wouldn't have to spend every minute of every day of their lives on the farm, that they would be able to drive to the city and see that too. So that was a really interesting perspective to have. I tried to get that into the book. That's an example of something that didn't make it into the book. But, trying to synthesize everything and make a really compelling argument for the fact that cars are really part of why we're in the terrible state that we're in. And people always look at social media and the internet and say, oh, that's why we're all so divided. But there's a lot of really excellent evidence showing that cars are a big part of that equation too. They're not the only part, but they're a huge part. And that leads me to something else. All of the book was difficult to write in that we set a very high standard for ourselves, that we were going to make arguments that were going to be backed up with evidence and not just, sort of ranting, right? And, it's easy to rant, but we have a lot of citations in this book, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of citations. That was probably the hardest part of the book.
Yeah,
was
that really
proofreading
was.
the citations.
Yeah.
But I'm really proud of that, because no one can look at this book and read even one page of it and say, these people don't know what they're talking about. There's nothing to back it up. There's plenty to back it up.
Yeah.
There's plenty.
I will say one last thing about it. Like, one difficult part was the history. We talked about the Superman part earlier. You could pick any one part of the history. We could have just copied Peter Norton almost word for word, right? And we do draw heavily on his research, and he's cited throughout the book because it's just so important in terms of anybody involved in this work. You have to read Fighting Traffic. And it's just, what Peter uncovered in that book and other stuff is great. But, you could do a whole book, right? And there are incredible books about the highway revolts of the 60s and 70s. But we had to condense that down to just a few paragraphs. There's an entire middle period of just before the Interstate Highway Act. And there's all the stuff from the rise of SUVs in the 90s and the early 2000s. So the history, getting it down to just one chapter and saying, we just need to set the stage for the rest of the book and tell you how we got here, that was really challenging. But again, fun. I got to read so many good books and talk to so many cool people. That was really the cool part.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the best things about this book is that you see in my background all of these books that I've read over time, and there's probably hundreds of them sitting up there, and they all have a really interesting and important point to make about this particular topic. But you all have distilled it down into 250 pages, fairly easily read. If I was not in this space where I'm talking about this all the time for the last 550 episodes or whatever it is we've done, that I could get pulled in and understand what was going on. And so if you're like a newbie, this is a great intro book. And even if you're an expert, there's a lot of stuff that I learned from the book that I didn't know before. The Superman thing was I feel like I'm terminally online, and I feel like I would have come across that at some point, right?
That's always been the goal of us with the podcast, and it certainly was with the book. My background is in television production, and the thing you learn pretty quickly, I've worked on shows for the History Channel, right? Is if you're doing a documentary about Abe Lincoln, you're going to get the people who know everything about Abe Lincoln and the people who are just like tuning in because they flipped over and happened to land on the channel. And you have to speak to both audiences at a high level and satisfy them. And it's challenging. I think we do a good job of that. Like I will, I don't want to break my arm patting myself on the back, but like I do think that has been the standard we always set for ourselves. Like someone's dropping into the War on Cars and this is going to be the first episode they hear, whether it's our first episode or 150th. I hope we can get to as many episodes as you have.
Oh, you'll be there soon. You'll be there soon.
But that really was the goal with the book. And it was almost like an instruction from the publisher. Like we know that people who are really interested in this topic are going to come to it and hopefully buy the book. We want to reach people who've never thought about this before, but might sort of be like, they just installed a bike lane on the other side of town. I want to see what this whole issue is about.
I did want to say one more thing, which is I just got back from China literally this morning. And I noticed that the changes there over the last, 20 years, just from understanding kind of where they were and where they are now, is just been astonishing. And there's a whole new high-speed rail network, which I got to ride, which was amazing. There's a whole new subway systems in a lot of cities. The switch to electric vehicles, and almost even more impressive is like all the electric motor scooters and stuff that are going around in the cities, not just electric cars. And what that shows me is that this is all possible with the political will to do it. And, with the advocacy that you all put forward and folks who get into positions of power like Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, who can actually make things happen at the city level, and Hidalgo, other mayors, advocates around the country are doing stuff. The folks that pushed back when Kathy Hochul decided that congestion pricing was going to pause for some weird reason, that this is all possible. And so, sometimes we get down on ourselves, I feel like, because it seems so slow. And like you mentioned in the book, you take 2 steps forward, you take 1 step back. But I kind of want to hear your feelings about the hope that you have for what's coming in the future. I mean, I go to China to visit my wife's family, and I'm just like, this gives me hope because they've done so much. And I know it's a different political system, and I know there's a lot of discussions that can happen about that. But it just feels like anything's possible, and we can do this if we really wanted to.
I mean, my biggest hope, there's 2 pieces. You mentioned congestion pricing. When congestion pricing died in 2008 under Bloomberg, he had been pushing for it. Lots of advocates had been pushing for it, but it died in a sort of smoke-filled room, typical political corruption that we're all used to. And it just went away. And most people outside of the inside baseball folks, the Streets blog readers, et cetera, not a whole lot of people cared for that long. When Kathy Hochul paused congestion pricing, there were rallies in the streets like the next day. And it was major news across every platform you could imagine, not just Streets blog, not just the War on Cars. And that gave me a lot of hope. It was younger people, especially, who were out there saying, like, we almost had something great and transformative. And look at you, Kathy Hochul, you're taking it away. And it was because of that advocacy. And from the top down, you had Brad Lander and others filing lawsuits, but you had this groundswell of people rising up and saying, no, like we have to do something. And it was climate activists and it was transportation advocates, groups that had been kind of siloed, 10, 20 years ago, all coming together. That gave me so much hope that like, okay, we have gotten to an inflection point where like these issues are so important. And again, I also think just the existence of this book has really lifted my spirits so much that a major publisher wants to get this out there and they think there's an audience for it. That tells you something, that like the issues are incredibly relevant to more than just us, the 3 of us sitting here talking, and people like us. So, we face some incredible geopolitical headwinds right now. And certainly, with the attack on cities from the federal government, I wouldn't want to sugarcoat it by any stretch, but I do think we are winning the culture war. We just have to get the politics back in order.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have seen so much change over the course of my lifetime in terms of people's awareness on this. And, the New York that I grew up in didn't have any bike lanes. It didn't have any public plazas. It didn't have even Bryant Park, which is now this gem of the park system, was this rat infested drug bazaar, basically. Like I've seen how reinvestment in cities has paid off, and that there's now a constituency for cities in the United States of America that didn't exist a generation ago. There's a whole generation that believes that cities are good and they want to stay in them. And now I think that if we can really focus on the fight to make cities more affordable, then we're going to have another exponential leap forward in the next 30 or 40 years. And housing affordability obviously is one of the top issues out there. And that struggle too has become allied with the transportation advocacy struggle and the climate struggle. And all of that is being seen, as Doug said, as more of a holistic whole now. And the thing that I say on the podcast all the time is that walkable neighborhoods should not be a luxury good. Walkable neighborhoods should be accessible and available to everybody of all income levels who want them. And they should be available in many, many more cities. I mean, I've had people say to me, well, you want this kind of a city? You live in New York. What's the problem? You have New York. Well, I mean, sure, I have New York, but I don't really have a lot of other places that I could choose to live in the United States if I wanted to live the kind of life that I'm living here. Whereas if you live in Europe, you have Berlin and Madrid and Paris, but you also have Grenoble and Hamburg, and you have Utrecht, and, you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cities across the European continent where you can live this way, and across Asia where you can live this way, right? So it can be done, and we can make it happen. And I believe that we're going in that direction because people want that. Nobody would even say out loud 35 years ago, cities are great. Nobody in America said cities are great back in the 80s and 90s. Are you kidding me? Everybody was like, oh, cities are dead. They're over. That's done. And you know what? They're not. That has made me hopeful, seeing the renaissance of the city. And I think it's a lasting one.
I also just want to say that our book is not just about cities, right?
Right.
The thing that also gives me hope is you're seeing bike bus movements in like New Jersey suburbs and rural communities and things like that. So even in places where you're still going to need to drive quite a lot of the time, people want to at least every now and then be able to like bike to school or walk to the grocery store. So a big argument we're making in the book is not that this is an absolute. You either have Manhattan or like rural Vermont and Montana. You can have a classic American Norman Rockwell-like existence that doesn't center around getting in a car for every last journey. That's really what we want to tell people.
The book is Life After Cars, Freeing Ourselves from the Tyranny of the Automobile. Where can folks get a copy?
Well, you can go to lifeaftercars.com, but it is available everywhere books are sold and at your local library. So support independent bookstores and libraries if you can. That's our plug.
Yeah, and buy the book for somebody whose mind you would like to open.
Yes.
And where can folks find you both if you wish to be found?
Well, you can find the podcast. It's The War on Cars. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, we're on most social media, not X, at The War on Cars. And you can go to thewarancars.org as well. But lifeaftercars.com will send you to all the places you need to go.
Awesome. Well, Doug and Sarah, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
It was great to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways. Hey everybody, thanks for listening this far past the credits. If you're here, I just want to say thank you to all of our generous Patreon supporters, especially those in our $10 Dallas tier and above. I just want to share their names, first names only, of course. But I figured this is long overdue that I let folks know that their support is much appreciative. Obviously, all the tiers are very appreciative, but this group has gone above and beyond over the years, and I really appreciate that. Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabriel, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mao, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Oliver, Steve, Abraham, Abby, Ed, and Matthew. We really appreciate you. And just can't say enough about how much the support from you all and everybody else on Patreon has really helped us out. So I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody. And yeah, so we'll see you next time.